Welcome to our third discussion around uh, pranayama as a means or force in meditation. So today's session is a deeper look at pranayama practice as a special discipline, and there's a number of directions, ways that we can begin to approach that. Uh, let's just begin with a reflection we've discussed in which that there's a range of breathing possibilities. On one end of the range, it could look very agitated or aggravated. Uh, you might liken it to like a waterfall or something like this, in which there's this tremendous kind of power and undulation and fluctuation and even violence. The water striking rocks and bouncing in everywhere. And that's one image of how the breath we could experience breath. That's one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, we could experience breath, again, to give you a visual, that pours in and out more like a stream of like a thin stream of oil. So if I were to take this pitcher and pour it out like that, and there's this stream, it almost seems as though it's standing still. It continues to pour. However, it's so kind of refined and I guess viscous that it sticks together like that. The contrast between the waterfall breath and the oil is quite stark. And then there's gradations of quality of breathing between those two extremes. And as another kind of applied example, we could look at somebody in a state of shock, say there's any number of reasons people go in shock, but let's just take a bike crash, for example, and the quality of their breath is like panting and up to here. Their state of mind is distressed, and that's reflected in the quality in which they breathe. So panting in and out through the mouth this deep. If you wanted to try that as an exercise, you can, and I'm sure you would feel more stress doing that than breathing more like that smooth stream of oil. And conversely, in deeper states of meditation, the mind's naturally absorbed, involuted. The breath is very refined. In fact, there's stories of taking like a very fine feather like this and placing it between underneath the nose as a kind of test for the quality of your breathing, a little down feather, and as a test of quality of breathing. And the yogi then is to control their breath to such a manner that it becomes absolutely still. And in so doing, there's a corresponding mental effect too. The mind becomes pinpoint still. And there's all kinds of discoveries and insights and peace and so forth that go along with that, just by virtue of slowing the mind down. And we can slow the mind down through the medium of the breath as well. They're woven into one another. To go a step further, exploration, there's regarded, this comes from Swami Rama, 3 pathologies. Interesting use of words here. 3 pathologies of breath, 3 basic buckets or categories of where the breath is deranged. And we may typically think of these things as, well, they're just kind of normal manners in which we breathe, but he's choosing to frame them as pathologies of breath, like you're sick or ill, or the same way you might have, pancreatic cancer, or you might have obstructive heart disorder. There's these pathologies or sicknesses of breath. And the first is gasping. So the way we might relate to this is, if you've ever been to yoga class where there's an excessive kind of hardening of the breath. and often expressed through ujjayi. So in Swami Rama's book, that's a form or example of gasping. And I've noticed in my own day-to-day life, I might even do it today as we talk, where there's a kind of catching of the breath. So a lot of talk words, and then trying to recoup, as opposed to a more measured approach to breathing. So the first pathology to become aware of is this idea of gasping. And the second is what's called irregular breathing. And irregular breathing means there's a bias or leaning or tendency towards either the inhalation or the exhalation. There's a dominant pattern or tendency to feel either more at ease or akin or accustomed to emphasizing the inhalation, or akin or accustomed to emphasizing the exhalation. Generally, I found over the years that yogis tend to be better exhalers than inhalers, whereas your CEOs and corporate executives and those who are taking on life with a firm grip tend to be more proficient at inhalation. And as we weigh out pranayama and our psyche, and what we're trying to develop here is a kind of baseline of one-to-one breathing. So it's the in-breath and the out-breath are the same count. And in practice, you can do this in asana, just to breathe in a 1-to-1 ratio, again, to establish this baseline. And we haven't even talked about the retention or transition at the top, or transition at the bottom, which we'll get into in other practices. So 1-to-1 breathing ratio as a kind of foundation. And the third example would be a pathology, would be emotional breathing. Okay. And this is not as exasperated as it might sound. Rather, it's a kind of refined reflection. And the refined reflection here is to notice any subtle irregularities within the breath. So if I were to take an edge of a piece of paper or edge of a sword, and on one level I stand back and I look at it and I go, wow, that's like crisp, ruler straight or ruler sharp. There's no imperfection or deviation in the straightness of that line on the piece of paper or the sword. However, were I to zoom in with a kind of microscope, I would look and see, and it looked like the Himalayan mountains, just all these little edges and creases and bumps and so forth, irregularities in the edge. So on one level, it appears straight. However, upon further or closer examination, there are little irregularities in the quality of the breathing. And that too is a reflection, right? In the same way that when we begin asana and just learning how to inhale and lift your arms over your head may seem like a monumental task, or it's like awkward or difficult to coordinate that, or you exhale forward and so forth. Eventually, you probably pick it up pretty quick. But that is kind of gross example of like a skewed relationship to the breath, and we just keep following that principle of refinement down to this principle of emotional breathing that I'm talking about now. And now our object of concentration, refinement, is very subtle. It's much more subtle. And a cornerstone practice to begin to explore nature or dismantle emotional breathing is what's called pure breathing, and in which, well, ideally it's all 1-to-1, in which the breath takes on a kind of elliptical quality, right? The transitions at the top are particularly smooth, and the transition at the bottom is particularly smooth, and it's very refined from end to end. And to do that, the diaphragm needs to be orchestrated or coordinated to move in a very kind of pulsating pattern. In fact, at no point does it stop moving, right? It doesn't come to a hard stop at the bottom or the top. It undulates or pulses like so. I think of the image of like a jellyfish, right? There's this certain graceful manner in which it moves, where it never ceases to move, and it's held in its own movement. So yeah, to recap, 3 pathologies of breath: gasping, irregular breathing, and this idea of emotional breathing. Okay, so I encourage you to work with those things in your asana practice or your meditation formal pranayama practice.